It's great. We good to go now?
All
Okay,
set.
great. Hi, everybody. Welcome today. Glad to have you here. My name's Savannah Shelnut. I'm an Ag Climate Resiliency Specialist on the CC Harvest New York team, which is a team that Lindsay's also a part of, like she mentioned. And we work to help farmers across the state increase their economic viability. So, briefly, what we're going to go over today, we're going to talk about what regenerative agriculture is. We're going to talk about four soil health principles that kind of play into regenerative agriculture. We're going to discuss integrating livestock. We'll talk about the importance of biodiversity and ecosystem health, your unique farm context, how you can actually put all these things into practice, funding opportunities, and we'll touch very briefly on some certifications for regenerative ag. So just a quick intro to our program. We're a subset of the Harvest New York team, like I mentioned. We're a two-person team. There's myself and another person. Her name's Kitty O'Neill. She's great. She lives in the North Country. I previously worked exclusively in the Hudson Valley, and she covered the rest of the state. But going forward, I'm transitioning into a new role on the Harvest New York team, where I'm going to be working with community gardens and urban farms. So Kitty will be the point for this topic going forward. But what we do is we work with producers to evaluate the impacts of climate on their operation and help connect them with relevant resources, whether that be educational materials, grant funding, doing on-farm research, all those things. And the reason why this kind of connects to regenerative agriculture is because, as we're going to talk about today, a lot of the practices that we're going to discuss have overlap with practices that are also considered climate resilient practices. So, getting started, what is regenerative agriculture? So origins of the term. A lot of the practices that we're going to talk about today aren't new, and indigenous farmers and other farming communities have been using them for thousands of years. They have just become more prominent in the forefront, and we'll talk about a few of the reasons why. But the term was really popularized in the 1980s. Robert Rodale formalized this philosophy into the term regenerative organic. If you're not familiar with Robert Rodale, he founded the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania, which does a lot of research on organic and regenerative farming for the Northeast and the entire United States. I would definitely recommend checking them out if you want more info there. But he describes it as farming that takes advantage of natural tendencies of ecosystems to regenerate when disturbed. So, like I mentioned, it's gained some prominence over the last decade. You might have noticed more people talking about this term regenerative agriculture in many different circles, and a few reasons why that's happening. Folks are talking more about regenerative practices as we seek to mitigate the impacts of climate change on our operations. For example, people are adopting soil health practices like reduced till to help increase the capacity of soil to weather extreme rainfall events. Um, other traumatic things that might happen on our farms. It increases as farms increase focus on soil health and reducing soil losses. So you want to keep as much soil in the field as possible because that is not an easily renewable resource. Corporations are adopting it for marketing and meeting emissions reduction requirements, especially those who are active in Europe and have responsibilities under the different scope requirements, scope one, two, three emissions, and they need to reduce those. They need to document how they're reducing emissions, and an easy way to do that is to do that through agriculture by sequestering carbon in soils. Additionally, the federal government has increased investments in soil health improvements. We know that the funding landscape's a little iffy in the right now, but through the IRA, there was a significant investment in soil health, and the current administration has reappropriated some funds that were allocated to other programs and translated them into this regenerative pilot program that's supposed to help farms adopt regenerative practices. Additionally, consumers are now demanding to better understand how their food is produced. People are more interested in what's actually going on the farm, where their food's coming from, and also the farm where their flowers are coming from. And the economics of adopting regenerative practices prove to make financial sense. So, some of these practices have been in play on larger scale farms for 50, 60 years, but it's just taken a long time to move it through the process, right? We had a lot of innovative early adopters who took on the risk of trialing these practices and see how they actually played out. Some of them have become proven to be very reliable, like reducing tillage, adopting cover crops, for example. And folks have seen that, so we're moving on to the stage where we have more farms that are middle adopters taking on these practices because they view it as less risky, or even late adopters in some cases. So, with when it comes to regenerative agriculture, we kind of have a definition problem here. Unlike the term organic, there's not a single universally agreed upon definition of regenerative agriculture. There is a legal definition of organic, and the USDA regulates what is and isn't organic. That does not exist for regenerative ag at the present moment. So, yeah, folks mean a lot of different things when they say regenerative agriculture. And right now, the American Society of Agronomy describes it as a pathway for producers to improve soil health and become more profitable. It's not exactly organic, it's not exactly conventional, it's kind of open and accessible to all, open to interpretation right now. And yeah, very differently defined by different people. And since this term's not legally defined by USDA or regulated by USDA at the moment, it's not legally protected like the word organic is. So that means that anybody can use it in marketing without meeting any standard, any particular standard at the present moment. So when we have this definition problem, sometimes it's a bit easier to talk about what regenerative agriculture isn't or what the thing isn't. So it's not a single certification, like I mentioned. There's no federal standard for the term regenerative. Anybody can use it without meeting certain marketing requirements. It's not all or nothing. You can adopt some practices, not adopt other practices. Partial adoption counts and is how most people start. It's not only for large scale growers, it's not only for small scale growers, it's not only for people who grow vegetables or people who grow row crops, it's kind of for anybody. Um, and that includes cut flowers. And we'll talk about funding later on, and cut flower growers certainly qualify for NRCS programs that help support soil health. And it's not something that you need to do alone. So NRCS, CCE, Soil and Water, we all offer technical assistance that get at many of the core principles of regenerative agriculture, and we're there to help you execute on those principles. So when you're thinking about seeking funding, don't necessarily think you need to find something that has regenerative in the label. Think more about the core of what you're trying to do and finding funding that matches that core. So why might you be interested in it as a cut flower grower? Um, Consumer demand is shifting, like I mentioned. Buyers are increasingly curious about how their food and flowers and fiber are all grown. And people really connect with um, foods, fibers that have a story behind them, right? And when you're selling something special like flowers, that many people go after for special occasions, and even people who go after them as a weekly expenditure, they're very invested in touching on what the story of that exact flower is. And you have a really opportunity there to market to this particular demographic. The rising cost of input. So, for example, folks that are having to rely on um, commercially produced nitrogen at the moment are having a hard time because of what's happening in the Middle East. But if you adopt some of these practices, you could reasonably expect to uh, decrease some of your inputs in terms of commercial fertilizers. And then generally, healthier soils equal healthier plants. And we'll talk a bit about how healthy soil is really at the core of what regenerative means. There's funding available to support these practices right now, so best time to hop on it is at the present moment. We'll talk about some specific resources available through NRCS and Soil and Water towards the end. And you're probably already doing some of these practices, even if you haven't fully realized it yet. How can you capitalize that and use this to tell that story that I mentioned to your customers? So today we'll focus on six selected principles. This is a great graphic that was produced by Kansas State University. There's an article that goes along with this that's linked in the bottom right-hand corner. I highly recommend checking it out if you're interested. But they say that regenerative agriculture is reshaping how we approach farming, focusing on restoring soil health, promoting biodiversity, and building climate resilience. And these are the six foundational principles that they have singled out as important, and those are the ones that we're going to go with today. So these foundational principles include minimizing tillage, keeping residue on soil, having a diverse crop mix, maintaining living roots in the soil, considering integrating livestock, and then remembering your farm context throughout the implementation of all these different practices. So now we're going to talk about four different soil health practices that come into play here. So just to set the stage, what is soil health anyway? What do we mean when we're talking about soil health? And we're going to go with the NRCS definition here. They define it as the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. So why do we care about soil health? We care about it because it helps, increasing soil health helps to improve soil structure, water retention, and fertility. And a huge benefit here is that we are reducing erosion. It takes 500 to 1,000 years to build an inch of topsoil. So it's a really important resource for our farms, and the better that we can hold on to it, the better off we'll be in the long term. So this is a great graphic that's released by the USDA. It kind of breaks down these four concepts and then gives you a little explainer on what exactly you're trying to achieve by all these different concepts. And now we're going to go through each of these one by one. So maximizing soil cover. Why might you be interested in doing this? Number one, like I mentioned, it helps protect soil from erosion. So when that raindrop or water particle hits the soil from irrigation, the wa the uh, the bounce off is not just going into a stream of water and then rinsing off your field. It's actually hitting a physical barrier that's preventing it from leaving and promoting water to infiltrate into the soil profile. Additionally, soil cover helps regulate temperature, so soil that's covered is less susceptible to large swings in temperature. You can think of whatever you're applying there as a blanket that's kind of holding in the temperature of the soil. Additionally, having cover on your soil helps to reduce evaporation. So if you're somebody that's concerned about water loss in times of drought, especially, this is something that you should really focus on. And having soil that's covered results in reduction of weeds. So think of maximizing soil cover as armor for your soil. How do you go about doing this? So popular ways of doing this are adding straw or wood chips around crops or in pathways. Consider cover cropping from fall into early spring or when beds are fallowed. Mulch pathways between hmm, between beds, sorry, are considered keeping grass or clovered pathways rather than bare soil. One thing that also comes up is that a lot of folks use landscape fabric to help cover bare soil or cover in between rows. And while that is helping to reduce erosion, that is a source of plastic, and I know we're all very conscious of and thinking of that. So, if you are able to transition into mulch or straw, think about doing that, or at least trialing out on a small area. On top of landscape fabric contributing to the plastic issue, um, it's not really contributing to building organic matter or adding root exudates into the soil. So, one thing to keep in mind also, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. So, it's okay if you start really small and then move upwards from there. Even small reductions in bare soil, whether by time or the amount of area that you're covering, can be meaningful, can meaningfully contribute to soil health. So, on the right over here, this is a picture of summer cover crops at Artemis Farm in Colorado. I chose this because I think this is a really great example of looking at different ways that cover crops help keep the soil covered. In the middle here, you see that they have this oat pea mixture that they've planted to cover the soil while this is not in production. But then on the sides, you can see where they had this, I think it was some type of rye cover crop that was in previously that they cut, and then they use the residue to help cover the pathways in between the production rows here. So it's a good example of multiple ways that you can use cover crops in your system. I know there's a webinar on cover crops coming down the line, so you'll be able to get more details on that later on. Next thing, minimize soil disturbance. Yet again, why is this important? Well, when you break soil open, it increases the rate of um, carbon leaving the soil in the form of carbon dioxide because microbes are better able to access oxygen, and that means that they're better able to metabolize the carbon that's in your soils. Minimizing soil disturbance also improves soil structure, enhances water infiltration, reduces erosion, and supports a healthy, functional soil ecosystem. I like to think about it like this. Imagine that you're a fungus or some type of microbe living in the soil, and you set up camp, you start building a homestead, and then somebody comes through and busts up camp every month or so. You're not going to be able to establish a sound base. You're going to constantly be moving and you're not going to be able to be very productive. So we're thinking about setting up systems where soil microbes can set up camp long term, get established, so they can be productive and help contribute to a functional nutrient cycling system within our soils. So tillage breaks apart soil aggregates, it destroys these fungal networks, it increases water evaporation, and releases stored carbon into the atmosphere. So in addition to tillage, some chemical applications and excessive grazing can also result in disturbances. So if you're somebody that's thinking about integrating livestock, keep in mind you don't want to keep them on one place too long. You can unintentionally maximize your soil disturbance here. So how might you think about going about doing this? One thing you can think about is swapping a rototiller out for a broad fork. This is a broad fork right here, and using that for bed pepper preparation. This does provide aeration to the soil and it does break things up a bit, but it helps the soil structure stay in place a bit better than just doing regular tillage. Use tarps to terminate cover crops rather than tilling them in. This is an example of tarping right here. And if you're interested in tarping and getting started on that, Cornell Small Farms has an entire guide on tarping. I highly recommend checking that out. Apply compost as a dressing rather than incorporating it aggressively, or apply compost on top of the bed before you broad fork to lightly incorporate it into the soil. And then, like I mentioned before, make these transitions slowly. Think about transitioning one bed or section at a time rather than converting the whole farm at once. You don't have to go all in all at once. You don't want to overwhelm yourself. And at the end of the day, we also need to acknowledge that no-till is not compatible with some systems, or some folks may not be able to put the labor in that's necessarily necessary for no-till, especially if you're somebody that deals with a lot of weeds and is not wanting to use chemical intervention. So think about how you can minimize your till. It's not all or nothing here. Next thing, maximize biodiversity. Why do we want to do this? You want to support your soil ecosystems, like I mentioned before. We're thinking about those microbes that are living in the soil and kind of anthropomorphizing them here again for a second. You wouldn't want to eat a hot dog every day for the whole year. So, you want diversity. Maybe you want a salad someday. Maybe you want pizza. Maybe you want something a little bit healthier. I don't know. But by maximizing crop diversity and diversity of your cover crops, you're providing a whole buffet that the microbes can go after. They can decide what best fills their need for that day, so they can set up camp there. Additionally, maximizing biodiversity helps break disease cycles, right? So if I'm planting dahlias after dahlias after dahlias every year, I'm building up some disease inoculum in the soil profile. But if I switch from dahlias to something like sunflowers, for example, we're removing the host of the disease for a year or two so that it's not able to build up um, in the soil. Additionally, biodiversity helps support beneficial insect communities that might be our friendly predators of some of the pests that we are dealing with. And by maximizing biodiversity, we're going to provide ecosystem services. We're going to talk a bit more about that a little bit later on. But one thing I want to note is that flower farms have a natural advantage here, right? Most folks who are flower farming are growing many different types of flowers within a given year. So yeah, you're already succeeding there. pat yourself on the back. How might you think about maximizing biodiversity on a cut flower farm? Think about mixed species cutting gardens when possible rather than huge monoculture blocks. If you're somebody that grows a ton of dahlias, for example, maybe think about putting in some rows of zinnias or something interspersed. One reason why you might want to think about that is if you're somebody that's really interested in promoting pollinators on your farm, you're providing something that has a bit different bloom time from dahlias that they can get in and get after that pollen. Rotate your crops. Like I mentioned, that helps break up some of those disease cycles and provides different root exudates for bacteria and fungus in the soil to eat. Think about interplanting annuals and perennials, right? So that means that you have some plants that are going to be there from year to year. Maybe if you're interested in supporting birds, for example, they're able to set up shop and have habitat in some of those perennials. And then think about planting cover crop mixes instead of just a singular cover crop. Next up, we're going to talk about maximizing continuous living roots. Over here on the right side, this is a great figure from our colleagues at Cornell Soil Health that talks about, looks at different root structures for different cover crops. And I think it's a great example of the diversity that's out there in root structure amongst all types of different plants and gives you a bit of an idea on, how different cover crops might be acting in the soil. So why do we want to maximize continuous living roots? Like I mentioned, we're talking about these root exudates that are coming out of the root and then going into the soil, and then microbes are eating on them. So these root exudates are things that are rich in carbohydrates. And some plants do set up symbiotic relationships with microbes that might provide systems uh, services to the plant. And the way that they facilitate that relationship is by providing exudates that are a food source to these microbes. Microbes then in turn take those exudates and turn them into soil glues like glomalin, which when you think about a soil that has good structure, right? You're thinking about a soil that's not powdery, it has an aggregate that holds up. And there's a test that you can do. I recommend checking out this app from the Soil Health Institute. It's called the Slikes test. It requires that you have the app on your phone and some type of dish to put a soil clod into. And you put that soil clod into some water, and the app records it and tells you, and based on how long it takes the soil clod to melt and how much it melts, it gives you an estimate of how stable those aggregates are. And aggregate stability is oftentimes linked to the presence of these of these glues that are coming from things like glomalin. Um, Roots also physically hold soil in place, and roots also, by their nature, reduce compaction and improve soil structure. So all these roots are going throughout the soil, they're busting up clods, and they're making channels that air and water can flow through to provide needed nutrients to plants later on down the line. So how might you think about doing this? Cover cropping again, you're noticing a theme here. Cover cropping is something that's really key here in these regenerative ag practices, and thinking about integrating perennials that are going to be living in the soil and providing root exudates all year round. So one thing to keep in mind here, tight production schedules can make this difficult, but even partial adoption can be meaningful. Once again, don't be afraid to start small and then move upwards from there. So key takeaways on the soil section. The four principles aren't independent. Each one reinforces the other, i.e. how cover cropping supports many different principles. You don't need to implement all four of them at once. Think about a practice that suits many of these or one that you're particularly interested in and start there. And then this is like a kind of a framework you can use to help think about how you might start implementing some of these soil health practices. Next up, integrating livestock. So background, why might you think about this and why is this a key core principle of regenerative systems? Number one, it's a closed loop fertility system. That means that we are providing feed to the livestock. They're eating them, they're excreting their waste, and then that's plant food for us. Additionally, some species can manage weeds. For example, chickens will eat some weedy things, but keep in mind they'll also eat your crop if you're not careful. They can eliminate plant pests. So here I'm thinking of ducks and their propensity to eat snails, which is a huge advantage to those of us that suffer from snail problems. And additionally, they're an additional revenue stream that you can incorporate in. And one thing I want to call out here is the agritourism aspect. If you're somebody that has UPIC or is interested in agritourism generally, people just love to see animals on farm. So that's one thing to think about there. So some livestock options for cut flower farms, chickens and ducks, they can forage between beds. Chickens scratch and incorporate organic matter into the soils. They eat insects and or arthropods. Sheep and goats can graze cover crops between production cycles, and they can help to manage brushy or weedy perimeters that might be creeping over into your production beds. Some things to consider though. They require significant additional labor. That's for general upkeep, moving coops and fences, all those things. They can also damage your cash crop if you're not careful, so be cognizant of that and prepare. Rotation of these animals is essential because overgrazing can have opposite effect of what we want and degrade soil health. Move them before they strip an entire area bare. And then think about matching the animal type to the task, the scale of your operation, and the existing infrastructure, right? So maybe you're not totally new to animals. You might want to start off with something simple like 5 or 6 chickens and then thinking about moving up from there if that works for you. And if you're interested in having animals on the farm, but don't really want to put the time investment in, think about partnering with your neighbors. For example, I'm thinking of a vegetable farm down the road from me. They don't have the capacity to maintain sheep on their farm, but there's a sheep farmer across the road, and the sheep farmer will bring over some electronet fencing, which is just portable electrical fencing, and set that up on the farmer across the road's field when they're done producing a certain crop, or if they want a cover crop terminated, and the sheep will graze that for a day or two, and then they'll move back across the road. So don't forget to look to your neighbors here. On the right side over here, this is something that I encountered that I thought was very unique and interesting. It's a sponsored sheep program through Blooming Flower Farm, and they're in the UK. And they've actually, on their flower farm, created this program where customers are interested in paying for the care and upkeep of these heritage breed sheep. And then they live on the farm and graze and eat cover crops and all those things. So, people are very passionate about animals, and I think there's a potential to tap into some unique revenue streams here if this is something you're really committed to going down the road with. Next up, supporting biodiversity and ecosystem health. So when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about thinking about your entire agro-ecosystem. And what do I mean by that? Your agro-ecosystem is your entire farm viewed as a living system. So we're thinking about the soil, the water, plants, insects, animals, climate, and all your management decisions coming together and interacting, and also thinking about the place of your farm within the greater ecosystem that you're living in. Perennial crops and mixed plantings create stable year-round habitat for pollinators, beneficial insects, and also birds. Cover crops, reduced tillage, compost application all build soil or organic matter, which are the foundation of a functioning food web, like we talked about earlier. And think about the ecosystem services that your farm is providing. Flower farms have a natural advantage here because you're growing flowers. And think about how that is something that consumers are really interested in, especially nowadays when people are very interested in practices that help support bees, for example. So on the right side here, this is a picture of chicory florals in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I chose to highlight this because you can see they have a lot going on here. They have trees off to the side. They have grass pathways. They have this production crop, which looks like zinnias in the foreground, and in the background, it looks like they have some amaranth or something that's a bit taller. But this is a very interesting landscape if you're an animal living within it. Very different from maybe looking at a soybean field, for example. So, this is a natural advantage of cut flower farms, and we should really emphasize that when we're trying to tell the story of what we're doing on our farms to consumers. So some considerations here that you could think about doing to help boost your agro-ecosystem. So think about installing bat boxes and bird houses for owls to live in to invite natural predators in. So this is a bat box system over here, and this is a house for a barn owl over here. Bats eat many different insects that are bothersome to us as humans and also bothersome to our plants. And barn owls are great to control rodent pests that you might have. And then think about installing ground nesting habitat for native bees. There are many different ways that can look. We could talk about that if that's something that you're interested in. Think about planting native species alongside production crops just to help boost habitat for native insects, for example. And then think about installing hedgerows, which are great bird habitat. And then another thing, if you're somebody that struggles with water, management, for example, think about installing a rain garden or a bioswale that can create habitat seasonally for amphibians, and it provides water to a host of different wildlife that might be inhabiting your farm. So now we're going to talk about how you can consider your unique farm context. So one thing here is that you want to be prepared for success. So to be successful, management practices must be adapted in ways that fit your unique operation and piece of land. So these are probably things you already know, but things maybe you want to sit down and think about a bit more deeply before you're planning to make this type of transition. So you want to know very deeply your soil, the general climate that your farm is within, but also the microclimate that your farm is situated in and microclimates on your farm. For example, if you're somebody on a slope, how does the soil act differently at the top of the hill versus the bottom of the hill? How does the light fall differently between an area that is close to a tree line and an area that's farther away? Think about the scale and infrastructure that you have on hand and what you might need to continue forward. Consider your market and production systems. Know what your labor limitations are. Consider your financial position, but also think about opportunities for grants that you might not have latched onto before. And then know what your general farm goals are. So now we're going to move on and talk about how we actually put this into practice, what some challenges are, strategies are, and a few next steps. So like I mentioned, soil health is really the foundation here. That's the anchoring principle for regenerative agriculture. And one thing to note is you can't manage what you can't measure. Most important thing that you can do is have a baseline soil test. And the way that I recommend selecting which soil test you want to do is decide what's most important to you. For example, are you somebody who really wants to manage for increased soil carbon? Is that what's really important to you? Then I would recommend making the investment in a comprehensive analysis of soil health. That is a test that's offered by the Cornell Soil Health Lab. But if you're not necessarily wanting to commit to something that's so expensive and you really just kind of want to measure differences in organic matter across time, look at your nutrients and pH, you can go for something that's a bit cheaper, like a regular agronomic soil test that costs about $20-ish each. Another thing to keep in mind here is that you want to keep really good notes on sampling protocol so you can replicate that exactly in future years. This helps minimize any error in your sample across years. So that means that you're taking notes of the exact area that you sampled, how many soil cores you took and then bulked into the sample, for example, time of year that you took it, and then when you come back in 2 or 3 years to take the test again, try to do it exactly the same. So that means same time of year, same area, same number of soil cores. So some common challenges in adopting regenerative practices that might be unique to cut flower production. So high bed turnover, right? Cut flower production can oftentimes require frequent planting and harvest cycles, sometimes multiple times per season within the same bed. If we're growing something that has really short growth time, like I'm thinking baby's breath, for example, and then we're following it with sunflowers or zinnias or something like that. That's a lot for the soil to take sometimes. So it makes continuous soil cover and no-till approaches difficult to maintain consistently occasionally. But one thing that you can do to help mitigate this is to think about rotating longer season crops um, interspersed with your shorter season crops to help deal with this issue. So for example, what I'm thinking is if you were having a system where you're having three different crops in a bed in a year or two different crops in a bed in a year. Next year, you follow it with something that's going to be in the bed for the whole season, like dahlias, for example. So another thing to think about is that if you have excessive space on your farm, I know it's not an issue that a lot of people have, but if you do have extra space on your farm, think about giving some of these beds that are doing these multiple cropping cycles a year off and cover crop them. Another thing that happens oftentimes on cut flower farms that might be a bit unique compared to other farms is that when we're harvesting cut flowers, sometimes we're harvesting more biomass than you would, for example, as a grain farmer, where you're just taking the grain and you're leaving the rest of the residue on the field to be incorporated back to the soil. I'm thinking about examples that might be where we are harvesting greenery, for example, and we're taking large pieces of the plant and those aren't remaining in the field any longer. So that means that we have to think about our organic matter management a little bit differently. We need to be conscious that we're taking it off and think about replacing it through compost, cover cropping, and other amendments rather than relying on the crop residue to cycle through here. And finally, one key tip that I have here is to lean on and rely on your neighbors. Look to what they're doing. Seek out field days and farmer-to-farmer learning opportunities, like craft events that are very popular here in the Hudson Valley. Would recommend checking that out. Um, and when you're thinking about learning from your neighbor, focus on the practice. You don't necessarily need to have a system that matches exactly. For example, you can think about if you're interested in adopting cover cropping, you don't necessarily need to go to somebody that's doing cover cropping on a flower farm. You could also learn a lot from somebody that's doing it on a vegetable farm, even though it might be better to have a cover cropping field day on for flower farms. But think about the practice, not the system. This is an example of a flower farm that I found here locally that's adopting a lot of these different regenerative practices. They have a really good website, which is why I featured them here. Six Duchess Farm. They're a 12-acre diversified farm, and key thing here is that they have livestock um, alongside their cut flower production and all these other systems that they're integrating. So they transitioned from pasture into regenerative farming system. I recommend checking out their website so you can learn a bit more about them there. So where do you even start here? Here's a general roadmap that you can think about implementing. This is not, you don't have to follow this exactly, but here's an idea of where to start. So this season, if you're thinking about making some of these transitions this year, most important thing to do would be to gather your baseline data. So that means taking those soil tests if you haven't done that before. Taking pictures, documenting where you're starting out from, because those pictures are going to be worth 1,000 words 3 or 4 years down the line when you've made this transition. Additionally, you want this baseline data when you're applying for NRCS or SARE funding. Another thing to think about is making maps and taking note of where things are happening on the farm, taking note of where things aren't going well on the farm so you can think about adaptations that you can implement down the line. Identify a single bed or section on your farm to experiment with. So think about maybe an area that has a bit of a problem, maybe a bed that dries out really quickly, thinking about starting there with some of these interventions. Identify technical assistance and funding opportunities. So that means reaching out to folks at Extension, NRCS, Soil and Water, getting them on your team and signed on to what you're doing so they can help you explore some of these funding opportunities that might be out there. And then maybe just try one new thing. It doesn't have to be big. Maybe you think about reducing till in one bed or trying cover crops in one bed. And don't put too much pressure on yourself, right? This is a big change oftentimes. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good once again. Um, you're just starting out. Accept that things might not always go your way and then keep trucking on. So, like I mentioned, keeping good data is really key here to help you tell that story of what exactly is happening on your farm. So, I recommend keeping maps. They can be hand-drawn. You can make them in Excel, or you can try out Google My Maps, which is a free GIS software. Um, have data sheets on hand for what you did in what field and what worked and what didn't. You can do this in Excel, various farm management software. You can do it on paper. Here's a sample data sheet that you can access on Google Sheets if you want just a general one that you can try out for yourself. Think about which data points are most important to your operation, right? Are you really interested in understanding how the bloom yield changed after you adopted compost application in a bed? Maybe think about taking some counts and seeing how that differentiated between years. And then next season, expand on that new practice or two. Add a few more beds if you want to, based on what you learned in year one. Think about adding new soil amendments like compost or biochar. Introduce a new species into mixed planting area. Think about your above ground biodiversity and how you're going to build that out. And then if you're interested in integrating livestock, now would be a good opportunity to start small. So maybe a few chickens, like I mentioned, to start off, or a few ducks. And now that you have some baseline data on hand, consider applying for NRCS or EQIP or SARE funding to help get some of these practices implemented on your farm. Over time, what you should consider doing is making sure that you're tracking results across seasons. So what was the bloom quality like that year? How strong were the stems? Did anything change there? How is pressure differentiating? What are my input costs? Are there any trends in my soil tests across years? And acknowledge that some practices may take years before the results are obvious, especially when we're talking about these practices that build soil carbon. That can be a long-term commitment. You might not see the huge benefit for 3 to 5 or more years down the line. So patience is kind of key here in some of these aspects. And then revisit your farm context framework annually. So you're thinking about your soil, what's going well, what's not going well, what's going well in markets, how are all these things connected? Um, and your goals will evolve. And don't be afraid of failure, right? Not everything that you try is going to be successful, and it's okay to move on from it and try something new. So we don't really have enough time here today to do a deep dive on funding, but I just did a 4-part whole farm climate resiliency planning series that you can access either at this link or at this QR code. I'm sure you guys will get this presentation later on, so you can click on this link if you want to. But within that series, part three, I think, is all, or no, part four is all about funding. So I have a webinar you can watch that talks all about what makes a competitive grant, and it also talks about grant opportunities for farms in New York State. So if you want to deep dive there, if you want to understand NRCS and soil and water programs a bit better and how they might apply to these practices, I really recommend checking that out. Briefly, we're going to talk about certifications for regenerative agriculture. So like I mentioned, there are no federal standards like organic. So some third-party certifications have emerged to fill that gap, and they all have different emphases, and they all cost a different amount, and they all have different requirements. But none of them are universally recognized as, the regenerative standard. And this landscape's rapidly evolving as interest picks up in this area. So I just selected one example that seems to be the most popular option right now, and that's the Regenerative Organic Certified certification. And they advertise themselves as being a beyond organic certification. One key thing to note here is that in order to enter into this program, you already have to be USDA certified organic, which we all know is complicated and costly. And a lot of people avoid it for those reasons and just advertise themselves as organic practicing. So, one thing you can do though is go to their website and check out some of the frameworks that they're supporting in this program. They have a generalized framework that contains a whole bunch of different holistic standards, but then they also have a section on animal welfare, a section on farmer and farm worker health, and on soil health. So this certification's not only thinking about soil health, it's not only thinking about the animal aspect, it's kind of thinking about how all these things come together and play into building a system that is regenerating, not just sustaining. You can learn more about them at the link here. So some things to consider as cut flower growers when we're talking about certifications. Most of your customers cannot see how your flowers were grown, so certification could be a way to help folks kind of understand where you're starting from. So that's one reason to consider putting in the cost, effort, and time to get certified. But I want to bring up a point here in that a lot of folks that have cut flower farms are really good at social media. So if you're not wanting to invest in certification necessarily, take advantage of the fact that you have a phone in your pocket and you can just share at any time what's going on with people that are potential customers. So social media could be huge here for folks. Direct market growers, like folks who grow for farmers markets, CSA, weddings, you pick. You can often communicate your practices through storytelling, like I mentioned. And one thing to think about, especially if you are a U-pick operation, is adding signage that kind of helps explain what exactly you're doing on your farm. People are very curious to know, and just having a little bit of signage can really help them feel like they're contributing towards a greater good. So take advantage of the fact that you have them there on your farm and can provide a little bit of education. And wholesale and retail buyers are increasingly asking for documentation, so certification matters more as you move up the supply chain. So if you're somebody very interested in wholesaling, maybe it makes more sense for you to be certified then. And at the end of the day, invite people onto the farm if you're comfortable. Um, your story is really going to be your power here and sharing how you are regenerative and regenerating. And having people actually in place seeing what you're doing is really powerful. So using the term regenerative in marketing. Like I mentioned, it's not federally regulated, but as the term gains mainstream traction, consumer and regulatory scrutiny of green claims is increasing. So the FTC has been tightening its green guides around environmental marketing claims. So one thing to keep in mind is that we don't want to be saying wild things when we're talking about our regenerative practices, right? You don't want to be vague or say something that's unsubstantiated because even though there's not federally regulated regenerative agriculture term here, you could create some risks in terms of legal risk or reputational risks. Be transparent with folks. Don't just say that you're a regenerative grower. Detail how you actually do it. People are actually really interested in that. Like I mentioned, stories are our strength here. And then use the tools in your toolbox to weave a rich story. So that means showing pictures of your transition to consumers, providing soil test numbers if people are interested in that, and having conservation plans on hand to help talk to consumers or potential wholesale buyers if they're interested in those things. So bottom line here, start small. Gather your baseline data. You don't need a certification at the beginning. Certification matters more for wholesale. Don't be afraid to use your own story as a marketing tool. Identify and take advantage of funding opportunities from the state, especially. The certification space is evolving rapidly, so be aware of that. If that's something you're interested in, just be sure to be tapped into that space and keeping up with what exactly is happening. And it's not necessarily about the journey here, right? It's not necessarily about the destination here, right? It's about the journey. So all these different practices are oftentimes a multi-year process, and um, oftentimes sharing what happens as you go through this journey is a really powerful tool. So with that, I'm ready for any questions that you guys might have. And I see there's some in the chat. Let's see. Okay.